for why we're here and the promise of some of the methods we'll be talking about. These motivations will vary strongly from project to project. If there's one constant that strikes me from the dozens and dozens of projects I've been involved with mobile data collection, it's the fact that no one is the same as the other. There's quite a diversity, and the motivations vary as much as the particular circumstances. But within this lecture, I'm going to endeavor to communicate to you some of the most unique areas of need and contribution for smartphone and wearable data collection that really, I think, set it apart from other types of data collection. The particular studies you're anticipating may not tap into any of the particular opportunities I'm highlighting here. But by highlighting them, I'd like to encourage you to think a little bit broadly about whether any of them apply to your circumstance, and hope to orient you as to the broader uses of these technologies, okay? Within the health and health sphere, which is the thoroughgoing focus of this work. Okay, so I am going to jump into this. I'd like to begin by talking about some challenges associated with existing techniques, some areas where traditionally or increasingly we encounter particular difficulties. And I'd like to then talk about some of the unique features of smartphones as uniting two different spheres of enormous importance to health and health behavior, and its understanding and its influences, namely factors within the physical world and the electronic world. And I'd like to then go into a set of use cases, a set of particular examples where the mobile data collection ends up being of particular value. So one observation here is that there's a broad set of spheres that for decades, if not longer, we've been aware in health and healthcare have been underserved and under-evidenced by traditional measures. The NHANES 3 study in the States in the 1980s brought to our attention the big gap between self-reported physical activity on one hand and what accelerometer data suggested. Similar studies have looked at profound differences between what people state as far as their nutritional intake on widely separated survey instruments versus what's actually captured by closer observation. Our own work has shown big gaps in location, location with respect to location between what's self-reported and where people are spending their time. And one study conducted on this campus, we found undergraduates would mention patterns of spending time that were where they spent time that were very different from what was recorded using GPS and other smartphone-based locationing mechanisms. When we actually looked at where they spent their time on campus, it was like night and day from their claims. A lot of their claims were things they're spending time in the library, spending time in the classroom, spending time in the dining area, Place Riel, in the bus depot, and we found that their actual patterns geographically and within the buildings were at night and day difference from these claims about where they're spending time. Similarly, in terms of with whom they spent time, their social context and spatial proximity, often there were big gaps between what they were reporting and what we picked up. As a result, we found ourselves wondering about the reliability of a lot of traditional self-reporting in many of these areas. So one challenge here is that a lot of key factors that play into risk, that play into resource availability, that play into health behaviors are difficult to measure in a low burden, high accuracy way using traditional instruments. At the same time, the tried and true methods where this data can be collected without undue burden and fairly reliably through, say, collecting self-report information via random digit dial surveys on telephones has become harder and harder to secure. Telephone surveys are becoming increasingly non-representative and expensive. When you dial people on landlines, a lot of people, not evenly distributed by age, screen those calls out. Those who do answer tend to be skewed demographically towards older individuals, sometimes individuals seeking a degree of social contact. And as a result, many who have relied very heavily on telephone surveys for larger scale panel instruments or in other contexts have found themselves dealing with escalating budgets to achieve the same level of data quality. At the same time, there's a proliferation of content channels that makes it more challenging to reach potential participants to opt into studies, and more challenging to get individuals to participate or to deliver their responses. Some now conduct surveys via Facebook, others via email, others via SMS, others via mechanisms through browsers, and smartphones play a role as an option there. There's also certain demographics that are challenging to reach with traditional instruments. Youth are one of them. We have a lot of people coming to us with an interest in smartphones because they find it difficult to reach out to younger populations. But vulnerable groups, underrepresented groups, demographic groups who have different sub-communities centered around different platforms are also distinctive. At the same time, I want to highlight that smartphones serve as this unique nexus between two different worlds, each of which is rich both from the perspective of evidencing health behaviors, interests, knowledge, attitudes, beliefs on the one hand, and influencing those. So a smartphone carried by an individual, in some sense, records routinely as part of existing software run by various commercial agents involved, largely without meaningful consent, a wide variety of aspects of context, whether it's aspects of physical context, circulation in different environments, aspects of the food environment, physical location, which may expose people to messaging, for example, people's toings and froings, and even aspects of social context in the world can be readily captured within smartphones. At the same time, smartphones are in this intriguing position of being the nexus for contact with all sorts of electronic influences as well, whether it's YouTube videos or Facebook status updates or tweets, whether it's aspects of the food environment as indicated by Yelp reviews or Instagram or Snapchat messages. The smartphone is sort of the conduit for a lot of those messages coming into a person, and in turn, posts from that person, say, to Twitter, or posts that are made via Instagram or Facebook updates give us some understanding of attitudes, beliefs, knowledge on the health sphere and, to some degree, health behaviors of an individual. So smartphones have this sort of unique straddling position between these two worlds which are increasingly important, each of them, for understanding health behaviors, but also in terms of their influence on health behaviors. For example, physical location, in as much as it mediates access to a food environment, to a messaging environment, to aspects of the built environment germane to physical activity and sedentary behavior, and social context is of great importance for understanding certain aspects of health behavior and exposures. But at the same time, this electronic world, particularly for youth, plays an increasingly large role in shaping aspects of behavior and of belief. So smartphones here have a unique straddling role that places them kind of at the center of action, whether desirable or undesirable, with respect to many people's lives and with respect to evidencing what's going on with that person's lives with respect to health. Now, reflecting this, there's a set of needs that have emerged within the past half decade or so, going back a full decade, for mobile data collection, which have motivated study after study in drawing us to the use of mobile health technologies. And I'm going to go through these quickly, reflecting that we want to move on to very substantive material for the balance of the day. But this is to give you some sense of why many people use these phones. One of them, and probably the single most common reason that people use smartphones, is to capture self-reporting in a more accurate and lower burden way. Because of this device we carry around in so many circumstances and use ubiquitously, it also provides a very natural place to ask questions. And there's many components of this in terms of low burden. And you'll see many throughout the week and these other sort of key motivators, a bunch of aspects of this that are enabled by Ethoca, whether it's audiovisual reporting photos of food that you've eaten, or photos of a barrier to physical activity, or a video of a service dog engaging with an individual who's suffering from PTSD, whether it's aspects of automatically capturing where a given type of health behavior is taking place or with whom it's taking place. Smartphones can play a high role in lowering the burden because they allow for reporting and automatic reporting that supplements what otherwise could be quite burdensome description of those set of factors. Smartphones offer intriguing potential by contextual triggering. We'll hear this quite a bit in the course of the week. Mohammed will show you how we can use Ethoca to trigger surveys, say, based on the presence of a beacon. So maybe it's when you are nearby your prosthetic limb, something that Alan McLean has explored. Or maybe it's when your service dog hasn't been nearby for a certain amount of time and you want to understand why. We can trigger instruments based on contexts that are significant. Another example being questionnaires about aspects of exposures. Maybe it's your exposure to a park or to an adverse built environment from the point of view of physical activity, and questions can be asked just at that time, proximate to that exposure. There's the capacity for proactive reporting of an individual and to answer questionnaires at any point, to defer them until later, answer them in that checkout line in the grocery store and wait to complete it until later in the day, and the capacity to break these things up into bite-sized instruments. At the same time, smartphones are not merely provide a route towards lower burden, but often greater accuracy. And one of the reasons is lower recall bias. We can ask a question about why you're in a park when you're in the park. We can ask a question about your satisfaction with an exchange with your healthcare provider while you're in the provider's office or shortly thereafter. We can ask about what you've eaten at a time proximate to your eating rather than 2 or 3 weeks later, as some of Cheryl's work has examined. So here we can gather reporting at a time that's less likely to be thrown off by the vagaries of memory or subsequent events. Secondly, there's less of a need to mentally aggregate over time. What I mean by that is there's a big difference between asking how many fresh fruits and vegetables, servings of fresh fruits and vegetables do you think you've eaten per day for the past month. There's a lot of calculations that go on there because, okay, you were at a set of holiday events during that time. Also during this time, you're doing some traveling. And there was also that friend's wedding. And it's a bit hard to combine all that in your head and give an accurate reporting. Whereas if you're asking, once a day or every meal, you're often imposing less of an abstract question for that person. And so they're thinking in more concrete terms about, okay, how many did I have today? Thinking about the particular meals. Often audiovisual, documentation like a photo of the pills you're taking, a photo of the food you're eating, provides a very, succinct sort of summary of it that's more clear than simple self-reporting. And finally, there can be a more complete reporting of symptomology that doesn't precipitate care seeking. So if I'm feeling lousy today, and I may not go to a provider to seek care for it, but I have the opportunity with a phone to report that I'm sick. Cheryl has conducted this wonderful foodborne illness study, and people were exercising that reporting of feeling ill far more frequently than they reported seeing a provider for that illness. And so this can give a sense of exacerbations like Erica is exploring in some of her work, or aspects of symptomology that are brushed under the rug through traditional studies, but may be important for understanding absenteeism, et cetera. A second major motivation here is, and this is a central one, to understand outcomes, patient-reported or recorded automatically, cognitions and behaviors related to risk factors, and I include exposures here, and specific pathways. I do a lot of modeling. I think a lot about generative pathways, mediating influence from one thing to another. And one thing that really attracted me very early on, actually before I came to the U of S, I started at MIT, I started doing work with sensor-based data collection and had a strong interest in how it can inform our understanding of health behaviors. And one of the reasons is the longitudinal depiction that it can offer. It kind of offers an opportunity to, as it were, collect biographies of exposures and behaviors over time. So there might be a person who sought care at some point. That person, if we want to understand what precipitated that or what led to that, this may be an individual, did a lot of work with surfers in Southern California, believe it or not. I may not seem like a surf personality myself, but I certainly worked with many who were, and good folks. So in this context, we might have an individual sought care for highly credible gastrointestinal illness, but that individual suffered pangs of it previously. They may have bathed at a certain beach here, which had risk ratings, which are recorded through municipal instruments, through the sampling that's done, that indicated different enterococcus levels. And there may be certain periods where they were bathing despite beach closures and advisories being posted. Very real phenomena in Southern California, and one that precipitates likely tens to hundreds of thousands of occurrences of HCGI. Or maybe you're dealing with tick-borne illness and potential Lyme disease, and a set of symptomology, perhaps early on not enough to precipitate care-seeking, was preceded by some exposures, like a tick that was found and a rash that appeared, but was never brought to the attention of a care provider. For PTSD, perhaps we have training with the service dog. We have instances of acute flashbacks by a veteran with PTSD. This is work that Jenna is helping to lead. I'm not sure if Jenna's in the room at the moment, but she's doing some wonderful work with this, and Audemus and Colleen Dell. So you may have flashbacks occurring. There's a period before they get the dog where these may be more acute. It's accompanied by poor quality sleep and sedentary behavior that's more pronounced, and lower levels of social engagement. Following the introduction of a dog, perhaps the flashbacks because the dog recognizes particular signals of stress for that person, and they're trained all through this period to intervene, to cut off flashbacks before they become visceral. The dog brings them out into a community of others with dogs, helps the individual with fewer flashbacks, and the dog providing interventions that lower stress levels, better quality sleep, and by the dog bringing them outside, they get more levels of physical activity and less sedentary behavior. So these sort of biographies are the sort of things that can be picked up and evidenced using data from combining self-reporting and combining automatic recording of where people are, and linking it with things like, was the beach closed, or what was the risk rating for that section of the beach historically. Other things that can be reported are things like pharmaceutical intake and evidence with photos, and not surprisingly, aspects of location and physical activity and social context and communicational behavior, including, say, app use and screen time, as well as aspects of decision-making. So we can gather information. This is from work with Harvard on message exposure to individuals. This from Houston. We have comparable data from lower-income communities in Massachusetts. So this is gathering sort of where people in the study spent their time, and we can cross-link that with where the tobacco-related billboards are, for example, where billboards promoting particular types of cigarettes. And there's a wide variety of health areas, specific health areas, where this information can be useful. I'll just provide those there. The slides are available on the site if anyone wants to sort of delve into my thinking on that. Another area I'd like to talk about the contributions from these tools being of particularly great value is really enhancing the speed, reliability, and depth of learning from interventions. And this goes a long way to this notion of causal pathways that I referenced earlier, but I didn't show anything on. So the idea here is, look, consider an intervention like smart dogs. Yeah, that's a great intervention. Erica can attest to that. Smartphones in the context of service dogs, or consider an intervention like moving a family from a low-income environment to a low-income area of housing to a mixed-income area of housing. Within these cases, often we are interested in understanding the overall impact of that intervention. Was it successful or not? But an important set of takeaways that we can elicit increasingly with tools like this are why was it, what worked, what didn't work, what aspects of it were successful, and what aspects did it fall short. What aspects of the intervention may have been working at cross purposes for each other. And this gets to the whole issue of causal modeling, which many of you know from this very floor I teach on and other events. But the idea here is, and this is one of the big draws to me of this sort of work with smartphones, to be able to use tools like smartphones and wearables to understand why an intervention worked, how it worked, so that even if it wasn't successful, we've advanced our learning and we know what we could do better next time. If it was successful, we could probably know how we can do even better next time. Okay. So the idea here is, look, okay, so people are moved, a family is moved from a low income to a mixed income neighborhood. And maybe we're interested in some broad outcomes, such as the impact on obesity levels. This is actually based on, the motivation for this was most immediately stirred up by some work by Jeannie Brooks Gunn at Columbia, with whom we collaborated, but also the Moving to Opportunity study more generally in the States, if any of you are familiar with that. Now, if you think about the impacts of an intervention like this on obesity, they're manifold, right? They're multifactorial. So a family in this new environment their obesity levels might be materially affected through many different particular pathways. Some of them are through the perceived safety of that environment, which motivates higher levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Kids can be outside at night and can use the parks more readily, and can use ball courts with less risk later into the evening, and as a result, it leads to lower BMI and improved obesity levels. It can also lead, though, that move can also precipitate greater access to recreational space. There may be more green space in that new neighborhood, which stimulates moderate to vigorous physical activity. So it may be that it's not so much through perceived safety, but just there's more green space around. Or it's a more walkable neighborhood, and that leads to more being out on the sidewalks and walking to the bus stop with less trouble, walking to school, and that lowers BMI through that, even if it's not moderate to vigorous physical activity necessarily. At the same time, perhaps some of the effects on obesity are through healthy food availability. We're not dealing with a food desert anymore. We're dealing with an area where there's good food stores in place that have healthy fresh fruits and vegetables available. We have more proximate access to neighborhood markets, and it improves healthiness of diet, and that leads to favorable changes to obesity. So when we're dealing with a blunter outcome, like obesity levels, and through broad self-report, often it's hard to reliably know just how much things have been changed along the way. I mean, we can ask, how much walking are you doing, or your perceptions of safety? That one might be a little bit more reliable. And we certainly know something about the availability of food, but asking people how frequently they go to the grocery store might not elicit great accuracy of responses or about their healthiness of diet. By contrast, with mobile data collection, there's a hope that we can actually start to look at these particular pathways. For example, how much are people engaged in sedentary behavior before and after, or in moderate to vigorous physical activity through accelerometry and heart rate? We can look at, are people going to their old neighborhoods? To what degree are they tapping into the grocery stores? To what degree are they visiting them? To what degree are they outside at night? Right? To what degree are they making use of the extra green space, or is it more that they're just engaged in less sedentary behavior? We can start to probe these things. There's no silver bullet. This is not immediately obvious, but once we have a more fine-grained, temporally granular type of way of measuring these things, we can start to figure out what might be going on along these different pathways that would explain why we see these changes in obesity levels. For those not familiar with the moving to opportunity study, obesity levels did improve for teenage girls. For teenage boys, it was not significant, and there was actually some adverse outcomes measured. I think it was in likelihood of school graduation and pro-criminal involvement. And there were hypotheses advanced, about movement of the boys to the old neighborhood without parental supervision. But without a strong evidence base to back it up, it's hard to move it out of the realm of a conjecture. Whereas with these tools, we can probe these things more effectively. Okay, now a key subcase of this need to understand why interventions work, how they work, where they could work better, to understand along different particular pathways what's going on, which incidentally is of great importance for dynamic modeling, for those for whom that's a meaningful statement. There's a key subcase here involving why we use these tools. And a key subcase has to do with interventions that are mediated by the phone. And as many of you know, there's a large and rapidly growing literature on smartphone-delivered interventions. These are not merely studies seeking to collect information from smartphones, but seeking to deliver an intervention, nudging people by smartphones, sending SMS messages, encouraging them to engage in certain types of pro-social behavior or positive physical activity or what have you. And smartphones have been of great interest in this regard because of their ubiquitous totage and because of the ongoing contact that they offer, et cetera. And they're very convenient. Now, if you're engaged in intervention delivery with those tools, conducting smartphone-based data collection to accompany that is a natural pairing. Why? Well, for several reasons. The one thing is, per my previous slides, it gives a strong sense of intervention impact. What changed when you deliver this intervention to encourage greater levels of physical activity with a social support group? Did you actually see them, engaging in more moderate to vigorous physical activity and less sedentary behavior? Did it change their interaction patterns with others? These are things that can be recognized, and you can tease that out from recognizing changes to diet if you have questions related to that that can be well evidenced on the phone. But beyond that, beyond getting the sense of intervention impact before and after, pre and post, as it were, you can get a sense of intervention exposure. Because if you're capturing on the smartphone their use of the smartphone, how much time they're spending with it, when they had it on, when they were engaged with certain apps, you could probably get a sense of how much are they being exposed to the intervention app or the messages coming through the intervention by virtue of the data collection. And so then that gives you a sense of, okay, what's their dose of this intervention, as it were? To what degree are they really being nudged effectively by the intervention, or being nudged frequently by the intervention? Or to what degree is it a much more episodic thing? Are they spending minimal time with the intervention app, for example? The final point here is that intervention delivery management, as you'll see through Ethica, this exceptional system that Mohammed has built, the delivery and management of this intervention can often share mechanisms with the data collection. So Ethica can be used to deliver these interventions. This messaging, it can be used to deliver encouragement to nudge people at certain points and based on their behavior, et cetera. So this is a subcase of examining the effects of interventions where smartphone-based data collection is just, it's leaving money on the table if you're not doing it, because It can be done often with the same mechanisms, with the same systems, and give a much better sense about what's going on and what the impacts of that intervention is. So moving towards the later part of this presentation, another use of these devices is trying to understand choice context. When people make different choices, whether it's physical activity, sedentary behavior. This is some work that I've been privileged to do with Erica that was really eye-opening to me. I mean, it shocked me to see the different patterns of smoking and vaping in individuals who did engage in both, and to see particularly the longer periods of vaping that were observed compared to periods of smoking, which were more episodic. So this is an aspect of sort of the micro-behavior of these that reflect context and choice. And also where people were vaping, where they were smoking, for example, vaping in cars, what prompted use of an e-cigarette versus a cigarette, for example, or location of use with respect to social events, home, work, etc., which exhibited some statistical differences. Finally, I want to talk about the use of these devices to understand something that's justifiably of great concern, great significance, and an increasing significance, and particularly in our youth, but a growing segment of our population. So I had mentioned before, and I'm tempted to show it, but I don't want to give you whiplash, that smartphones serve as this key nexus between an electronic world and the physical world. And so much of what goes on today in terms of exposure to messaging, to attitudes, beliefs, to belief systems about health is device mediated, particularly for our youth. Who, for the elders of us among, in the room, I'd rather browse on a browser on my laptop. Thank you very much. And I'd rather type on my laptop. Thank you very much. But for a growing segment of our population, youth, but also lower SES individuals, where the smartphone is that key link to the electronic world, and maybe they're only electronic, that they're only linked to that world. Everything is centered on this phone. The world is centered on the phone, and the device mediates so much of their exposures of relevance to health. And as such, it is simultaneously a big influence, but simultaneously has access to evidence about those behaviors, knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, etc., and exposures that are formidable. So here, smartphones are key to understanding this sort of context, the electronic world context and its influence, in addition to gathering where we are, who we're with, what activities we're engaged in the physical world. So, device communicational behavior gives some indications of what's going on health-wise in the person, but also it's a strong influencer. And I had noted, it gives that picture on both worlds, and it gives us an understanding of interests and behaviors on the part of a person, their underlying health situation, if they're homesick, etc. This is evidenced by changes of behavior on the phone, and exposures in the world include things like screen time, app use, as well as in the physical world. So this is another major motivator. It's like smartphones have this, and in some ways it's a frightening level of position, of centrality, of privilege almost within within our worlds. And you know, I, like lots of other people, feel ambiguous about it. They provide us this window into health beliefs, attitudes, and to influences on them that is therefore unprecedented, you know, as to what's going on. And with a fully consenting individual who understands in an informed way what's at stake in terms of offering up information, they do provide this really formidable portrait of what's taking place with respect to many of the key health considerations. So smartphones provide these types of insights at multiple levels of scale, and I'll just note it here. From the self and informal level, where they can provide sort of this more perfect mirror. Jenny Bazran speaks about smartphones as providing potentially a fingerprint of function for older individuals, those living with complex conditions, those living with multiple morbidities, and capturing an understanding of their situation and its change over time in response to treatments, in response to emergence of new conditions, in response to progress of existing conditions. And so self and informal care, smartphones give us a window onto this key factor out there that is often under evidence. What goes on in the community with someone who's suffering, like with the work from Erica that I so admire, the COPD, from the COPD side. What's going on for that person's life after discharge in their home? What's going on in their circle of care? What's taking place in terms of their level of exacerbations that they're experiencing day to day, in a way that may be only we get limited insight into through our clinical encounters with providers. At the level of clinical management, this information can help us understand patient challenges, challenges to self-care, informal care, symptoms, and context. I see it in a growing amount of my circle of family and friends, the growing use of extra degrees of recording to try to understand one's situation, whether it's measuring INR levels for individuals who have needs for concerns about hypercoagulation of blood, or whether it's levels of oxygen saturation. These extra devices we can use in our homes can provide us an understanding of our needs and how those needs are changing over time, and it can better judge when a treatment is successfully meeting those needs. And with the patient involved in that in the home, it provides that extra window of evidence outside of the clinical context and inpatient context. So health services delivery, a growing use of these sorts of tools have been in facilities to understand inefficiencies, bottlenecks, quantifying delays, identifying challenges of coordination of teams, offering that team-based care that's so sought after. So here, basically, using these devices to capture an individual's journey through an inpatient or outpatient setting, and understanding where there's needless loss of efficiencies, or where the team-based care can be offered more effectively, or where additional resources are needed to help it operate at full capacity. So health service delivery uses are evidenced in some of the references I provided in the background information in which you may have interest. And at the public health level, I have a great deal of interest in leveraging these tools, whether it's faster detection of outbreaks and localizing those outbreaks, or evaluating control strategies, understand the degree of social distancing that's occurring following advisories, how much risk exposure people are engaged in for things like West Nile, to what degree are they really following advisory guidelines about not being out in the evening outside, or limiting contact with areas of high brush, et cetera, or using appropriate personal protective mechanisms. To what degree are those being followed before and after an advisory? Of great interest. And we have some studies we've conducted related to this. And finally, strategic decision making. These mechanisms, together with the sorts of models that several in the room build, I think provide a formidable tool for asking what-if questions and asking about intervention strategies. Okay, so I provided a whirlwind discussion here of what I see as some major motivations for data collection, but really a lot of them come down to the challenges of traditional tools and the growing challenges of those tools as in light of technology change, in light of attitudinal change with respect to opting into traditional studies, and into what constitutes a burden in terms of involvement as a participant. And I've highlighted this key nexus occupied by mobile devices. Smartphones, yes. Wearables, yes. That straddle between this electronic world, which offers formidable significance for shaping knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors on the health side, and this physical world, which likewise has a tremendous impact on the healthy behaviors which we can sustainably undertake in our day-to-day lives, and smartphones as this tool to span both. Within this event, we're going to be talking about how smartphone data collection can evidence these worlds, can help us understand those influences, can help us understand the degree to which the behaviors associated with interventions are indeed being modified successfully, and the degree to which an individual's behaviors are reflected in shifts in knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs. So the Ethica tool, which was built to use this interface shown here, will be shown in as much as it runs on smartphones, in as much as it can also leverage wearables, and in as much as it can, in the near future, will be available on web as well. So Erica, yeah. Mm. Yes. Right. So it can capture certain aspects, and Mohammed can talk, about this more. So Ethica can capture information on use of apps, so which apps are being used, and can capture aspects of how much time people are engaged in use of their device, so the screen on and off time, so screen time in a blunter way. In terms of the actual messaging that's received, the situation here is very platform specific. So let me highlight just a few things before I get to Snapchat in particular. So Ethica does offer, and a lot of these are available on a per platform, a platform-specific basis, because iOS has some tighter restrictions. But for example, incoming calls or outgoing calls, or incoming SMSs and outgoing SMSs, that's something which one can enable as a data source within the context of Ethica. Mohammed, that's Android specific, is that right? No, the SMS and phone calls coming in, phone calls going out, and so that's Android specific. Browsing related behavior. We do have studies. So a study we ran with Vish Vishwanath at Dana-Farber at Harvard, which was one of two studies in which we've collaborated, made extensive use of a browser-based information that would capture URLs and the page contents when it messaged smoking or cigarettes or nicotine. It would capture full page contents, so you could look at what people were exposed to. And Chin Yang, who I don't know if is in the room right now, but she did some amazing analysis of this, showing the page contents and using word clouds to summarize what people are exposed to as smokers or non-smokers, etc. When it comes to platforms, social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram, etc. The needs are, so Ethica right now's ability to tap content in those is not really significant. Like it's not looking at what you post in Snapchat or what you post in Twitter. Now, that being said, we have extensive separate infrastructure set up, for example, for monitoring Twitter-related content. So in our lab, I think now we have somewhere between 200 and 300 million tweets archived, more or less complete tweets from certain areas of Western Canada. And there's the potential for cross-linking that information with what Ethica is providing for a person, looking at the tweets outgoing from that person, and by having them report what they subscribe to, you could look at tweets coming into that person through this mechanism here. And the typical route we've explored for social media is exactly that. By being allowed to have a certain degree of permissions on these sites that are posting, let's say Facebook, you can get a sense through a parallel data collection mechanism about what's being posted and then link it in with what's captured in Ethica. Ethica itself, in terms of, it can know that app is running, how much it's being used, but it's not going to see that you posted this picture on that app without some sort of separate linkage that captures those outgoing messages with what's on Ethica. And there's some reasons for that. Basically, the platforms, both Android and iOS, don't allow one application to snoop into all aspects of the other application. So what we can know is significant, which is, okay, this person is a heavy user of Snapchat. What we don't know is exactly what that content they're seeing, unless we have other agreements with them to share that content in some level through separate Snapchat-related mechanisms or Facebook-related mechanisms or Twitter-related mechanisms. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think, in principle, one could have a self-report there where someone could take a screenshot. So every time they go to post, you could, you pay them, 50 cents for each time they take a post of snapshot, a Snapchat photo. You get them to do a screenshot, which is easy to do on either of those platforms, and then they could report that via Ethica. I just posted this, or I just saw this. But that's fairly high burden in today's day and age. But maybe with the right incentive, maybe not much so. Maybe if you gave people Hulu coupons or I don't want to suggest adverse rewards, but you might be able to encourage behavior that would actually have them contribute those things. Or maybe you could ask them post your most recent Snapchat post by EMAs that remind them once every, when they once a day to post something, and you get a flavor of what they're posting. Good. Other questions, comments? Yes. Sure. Well, it depends a lot. So it's a good question. We will talk about the analysis quite a lot on the third day. What I'll tell you is that this is tied up with recruitment, right? Because you need to build up a large enough group to contribute that you're going to be capturing information from a group that's acceptable. It also has to do with when you're saying statistically significant sample, what behavior you're measuring and whether it's longitudinal in a given person. One notable feature about big data. Normally, when I've given past versions of this boot camp, I've had a talk which is big data in health, and I highlight the 4 B's. Big data, operationally, the least bad definition I know is it's data that's characterized by high volume. That's the big. It's characterized by high velocity, meaning it comes in frequently. It's characterized by high variety, meaning like a given data source, say a phone, will capture multiple types of data at once about the same, say, person and at that time, right? So you get this kind of thickened picture of these different evidence, these different generative pathways often, but these different areas of their life, captured in that timeline we saw, and then finally captured by high veracity, meaning you have physical evidence of what they ate rather than just what they said, and one feature of this data is that often from a given individual, you have much more in the way of data points than you do have counts of individuals in the study. So you might have, hundreds of survey responses from a given individual, even if your study was only dozens, in size. Or you might have from step counts, thousands and thousands of step counts, even though, you have hundreds of people in the study. And when you talk about statistical significance, there's a very real question to ask. What is the sample over which you're conducting that, a hypothesis test, for example? Is it a collection just of people, where each sample is one person, or is it a collection within a given person's experience associated with successive data points, which is often what we do as well, where we may get from a given person in the course of a day, some sort of statistically significant sample with respect to some level of sedentary behavior during that day or step counts for that day. So I think we'll want to unpack this a little bit more in coming sessions. But I welcome that question, and it points to a large amount of discussion we're going to have in this event on the analysis side. So I welcome that. Other questions? Yeah. Very good question. Yeah. So Mohammed's actually going to talk about 24-hour recall interface to Ethica. So you folks are here at a critical time for Ethica. Ethica has grown from being, a speck in the cosmic eye to being, Mohammed overwhelmingly, and now it's actually it's got 5 people working with it, and very rapid development going on along a lot of lines. One of the lines relates to this, which is tapping into standardized instruments, and as you have known, you've forgotten more about in the past week than I've ever known. There's this web-based 24-hour recall site that is maintained. I think it's out of the CDC. Is it? Yeah, yeah. And one of the directions Ethica is going, you'll hear a lot about them in Ethica's, where Ethica is going in coming months. But one of them involves an interface within Ethica studies so that you can do 24-hour recall through that site within the Ethica app. And that's one way of capturing it through validated instruments. Cheryl here has done amazing work with dietary elicitation through Ethica, and also comparing it in the context of recall. And with a study of, 90 to 100 people for about 3 months, with photos as well as text-based self-report. And she would be a really good person to talk to about this. We're also at a point in Ethica's use where this whole comparison with validated instruments, from the standpoint of not merely duplicating those validated instruments, so that's done a lot with Ethica, with duplicating standard instruments within the context of Ethica, so that we can leverage the strength of those instruments. But beyond that, using Ethica to compare with, like the IPAC, the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, and comparing that critically to what's available using step counts and more fine-grained reporting, not with that eye towards does it equal that, but where is one stronger than the other? This is going on a lot right now. And my colleague Tarun Kattapalli down in Regina is particularly active on the physical activity front, and for the nutritional front, there's also some needs there. So I would like to suggest that you might want to talk with Mohammed and Cheryl about that, but there is very, very large amounts of attempts to right now try to cross Ethica with validated instruments and compare with those instruments. Okay? Other questions? I'd love it if we can have this be an interactive boot camp, because there's going to be a lot of opportunities for us to address your particular questions more effectively if you want to raise them, and we can kind of spend our time on areas of interest to you. Okay? So this lecture was an anomaly today, in the sense that we're going to be spending most of the day going through the nitty-gritty of mechanisms in Ethica, seeing how you can build up sophisticated studies that can capture evidence from this electronic world, capture evidence from this world, the physical world here, capture instruments, be they validated or novel, with the survey-based system. And that's going to be the challenge to which we turn our attention following the break. Okay? Absent any questions now, I think we'll have a bit of a tea break, and we will reconvene with Mohammed taking the rightful stage. Okay? So thanks very much. Does anyone need help with Wi-Fi or login or anything like that?